Morning everybody, how are y'all doing today? I'm doing great myself, because today we get to revisit a topic that we haven't really covered much besides when Review Tech USA made a video on it, and that of course is the Series S being a bottleneck that is holding back gaming. Now this has been a common narrative among PlayStation fanboys basically ever since the Series S was revealed, and that's the video we're going to be taking a look at today. This video came, I think, right after the Series S was revealed, and this guy's basically just expressing his concerns. However, his concerns are dumb because they rely off of what ifs and the whole teraflop thing, which I'm pretty sure even now we still don't know how teraflops equate to gaming performance. And clearly the Series S has proved that they don't matter at all because it has less teraflops than the One X, but it's still much more powerful. So yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into this.
Microsoft recently announced the Xbox Series S, a cheaper and weaker console option for the next generation. And while it's nice that there's a $300 option for those who have a tighter budget, I believe it's going to come at the cost and the quality of the games in this upcoming generation.
Man, that aged poorly. I don't think we've seen a single game suffer so far as a result of the Series S. In fact, even to this day, Call of Duty is still coming out on last generation consoles, and it still looks and runs very well on the next gen platforms and PC. And even if you want to take a look at actual next gen games, let's take a look at Dead Space, for example. The game looks and runs amazing on the Series X and PS5. And yes, it runs at 30 on the Series S, obviously. But his whole argument is that the Series S is going to negatively affect the Series X and PS5 versions, and that is clearly not the case.
To start, I just want to point out how the existence of this console kind of negates Microsoft's biggest selling point for the Xbox Series X. The lower price of the Series S comes at the cost mainly of the number of teraflops with the GPU and the SSD data rate. The Series X comes in at 12.5 teraflops, while the Series S has 4. And the way this is being marketed so far is that the only downgrade will be the resolution, with the Series X targeting 4K at 68 frames per second, and the Series S targeting 1440p at 60 frames per second.
I mean, yeah, that's true, but I fail to see how this makes the Series X pointless. Because it's not just the resolution that you're missing out on, the graphics aren't going to be as good. And as we've seen with Dead Space and many other games, there might not always be a 60 FPS option. Now, a lot of the time there is, but there's going to be cases where you have to still run the games at 30, and you don't get a disk drive on top of that. So how exactly does this make the Series X pointless? I mean, I guess your argument kind of works because you left out the fact of, like, you know, the frame rate and the graphics and all that stuff. But just because there's a cheaper alternative, that doesn't mean that people are automatically just gonna buy the Series S instead. There's people, believe it or not, who still use physical media. On top of that, a lot of people want the most powerful console. They want to always have the 60 FPS option for games. They want the higher resolutions, the higher graphics settings, and also more storage. That's another thing. Now, last generation, this argument probably would have made a little more sense, because basically the only difference between like the Xbox One and the One X or the PS4 and the 4 Pro was like on some games you got like a 60 FPS option, but really it would be like 40 or 45 FPS or something like that, and the resolution would be like 900p or something. So there wasn't a massive difference there, but obviously the price difference was still there. So yes, last generation this argument would have worked a little bit better, but this generation it just doesn't make sense.
The main selling point for the Series X in the first place was the 12 teraflops. Oh, it's the most powerful console because it has 2 more teraflops than the PS5. Xbox definitely winning the next generation. But then Microsoft announces this console with 8.5 less teraflops that will play the same games, and the only downgrade is the resolution, which isn't even a bad downgrade considering most people don't even have a 4K display. It kind of makes the teraflops seem not very important.
Well, the reason the teraflops don't seem very important is because they're not. It's all marketing gobbledygook. It means nothing. Microsoft just loves to use it because they always love to flex the power of their consoles. And to any average consumer like yourself or even myself, we have no idea what teraflops actually translate to. But think about it, your average person is going to say, oh wow, more teraflops, more equals better. 2 extra teraflops, man, massive difference. I go buy Series X now. But again, it's not just the resolution like I stated earlier. In some cases, probably quite a few cases, in fact, games are going to run at lower frame rates. You're not always going to get the option to have a 60 FPS mode on games like Dead Space. And the graphics are going to be worse, and on top of that, there's no disk drive and less storage. There's really more downgrades than you're mentioning. But what I fail to see is, how is this a bad thing? Alright, let's pretend for a second that you're right, and the only thing that happens is the resolution gets downgraded. So instead of 4K on all your games, you get 1440 on all your games. If that really was the only downgrade, that wouldn't be a problem. In fact, that would be a great thing, because Microsoft would be offering basically the same console but with a lower resolution for almost half the price of the other one. Now, I do see what you're saying. In that scenario, the Xbox Series X wouldn't really have a reason to exist, because then it would just be an overpriced resolution upgrade. But that's not what it is in reality. There's way more differences than you're acknowledging, and I think that's where your whole argument is coming from. Lack of research, understanding, whatever you want to say.
Almost making the SSD seem more important for the next generational leap. And considering PS5 has a better SSD, which we have seen the importance of in games like Ratchet & Clank, it's very strange to me that Microsoft would release a console that downplays the importance of the only advantage they had over the PlayStation console. It would be like me trying to trade with you, and then right before we made a deal, I explained that the only thing I had to trade was not actually as valuable as I originally said.
I'll talk about the SSD thing in a second, but first, I just want to say, by this dude's logic, like, this whole argument could be used against the PlayStation as well. He could say, oh, well, the PS5 digital has made the PS5 completely irrelevant, because with the PS5, you're paying $100 extra for a disc drive, and that's it. Besides that, there's literally no resolution difference whatsoever or anything like that. So honestly, this argument is more relevant to the PlayStation side of things than the Xbox side. At least Microsoft made enough noticeable changes between the two consoles so that people would actually have to think about it. Whereas with PlayStation, it's just, oh, do you play physical games or not? And if you do play physical games, do you also have an extra $100 to spend? Which, don't get me wrong, simplicity is not a bad thing, but this dude's argument is that it is. The entire argument is, oh, well, there's barely a difference at all, but one is way cheaper than the other, so why would I buy the more expensive one? Which, again, would be a valid argument if the scenario was like he was describing. But since he wants to complain about how the Series S and the Series X are supposedly too similar, he should really be using that argument for the PlayStation, honestly. But as for the whole SSD thing, it's really not a huge difference. In fact, we've seen recently, like with Dead Space, the Series S actually loads faster than the PS5. So again, I think this dude either just isn't doing enough research or he's being like misled by the marketing or something. I don't know.
However, as detrimental as I might think the Xbox Series S is to the Xbox Series X, that is not the issue I have with it. My issue is that a weaker console is going to lessen the generational gap and decrease the quality of games. I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on computer science and coding and all that, but a weaker console is not going to be able to handle as much as a stronger one, and limits the possibilities for game developers. To me, a new generation is warranted when there is significant changes to the possibilities for the game developers. I don't want to buy a whole new console just so the resolution can go from good to slightly better and 60 frames per second to 62 frames per second.
Yes, and as we've seen with this generation, there have been significant leaps in how games are made, how they perform, how, like, the loading screens and stuff work, all that stuff. And the Series S has not been an issue. Anytime somebody brings up the Series S supposedly being a bottleneck, I always bring up PC. Because developers have no problem developing for PC, where you can have the most powerful tech in the world or the weakest tech in the world. And yet, usually both can run the same games. Okay, maybe not the weakest tech in the world, but you get my point. And at the end of the day, as far as I know, when it comes to games running on different platforms and designing different versions of games for different platforms, you know, I'm not an expert or a developer or anything, but I would assume that since games are developed on PCs, when the developers are making different versions for different consoles, wouldn't it just be a case of changing graphical settings? And then obviously when you release the full game, you take away the ability to change the graphic settings on console. So why couldn't they just make the game the best it could possibly be and just lower the settings for the Series S? I could be completely wrong about that, but I don't see why it would need to be much more complicated.
And what really puts into perspective how small the Series S might make the generational leap, the Xbox One X has 6 teraflops, 2 more teraflops than the Series S. Game developers are now going to have to develop their games with the restriction of the game being able to run on the Series S. I think of some of the best games of other generations, and they are the ones that are pushing the boundaries of what the console can do. Imagine if there was a PS3S that was half as powerful as the PS3 and launched with it. What if the PS3S was unable to load things quickly enough for the train scene in Uncharted 2 to function properly, and therefore that scene was scrapped? What if Fallout New Vegas couldn't run properly on the PS3S, so they had to take out the huge battle on Hoover Dam at the end?
See, this doesn't make any sense at all, though, because you said earlier in the video multiple times that the only difference between the Series X and the Series S is the resolution on games. So why would this be an issue if that was the case? Now, obviously, it's not the case. I've already established frame rates and, you know, graphics and all that stuff. But this dude went into this video assuming the only difference between the Series X and S was the resolution. And if that was the case, then this wouldn't even apply. This wouldn't even be a concern. By this dude's own logic, this video was pointless, or at least this argument. It just doesn't make sense to worry about something being a bottleneck if you think the only difference is resolution, because if that really was the only difference, there would be no need to worry whatsoever, because then all the devs would have to do is lower the resolution. There's a serious lack of sense being made here.
My point is that developers will now have to limit their games to a weaker console, ultimately limiting the possibilities for games. Just look at how disappointing the Halo Infinite reveal was, and keep in mind, they're trying to make Halo Infinite playable on Xbox One. I do recognize that some games engines can deal with this problem with scalability, Fox Engine being a great example, but this still requires development time for game devs. As we all know, with the dreaded crunch and game delays, time is not something that developers have a lot of.
If that's the case, though, then how are they able to still release games not only on next-gen consoles, but last-gen as well? I mean, you just said that Halo Infinite was coming out on last-gen consoles as well. But even in all of 343's incompetence, they're still able to make that happen. And if 343 can pull something off, I'm sure almost anybody can at that point. But yeah, anyway, guys, that's gonna do it for this video. There's not much more to that video. He just repeats himself over the last, like, 15 seconds, and then that's the end of it. Overall, I don't think it was a very good video in all honesty. He says the only downgrade between the Series X and the Series S is resolution, but then goes on to complain that the Series S is gonna hold back the next generation, even though he thought that the only difference was resolution and the developers would only have to lower the resolution. So if that's what he thought, then why was he even concerned about whatever. Point is, it just didn't make sense. But yeah, really quickly before I go, I want to thank you guys so much for 7,000 subscribers. I didn't even expect to get past 100 when I first started a little over a year ago, and now we're past 7,000 just over a year after starting. I honestly can't thank you guys enough for all the support recently. It's been actually crazy. And yeah, road to 8,000, I guess. But with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't like it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I will catch you all next time.